Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Marcia Eli, and I am delighted to greet you on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, our Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, and BPL Center for Brooklyn History, this place. The United States has the largest known prison population in the world. In 2023, the count is over 5 million people under supervision by the criminal justice system and nearly 2 million people incarcerated in state or federal prisons and local jails. It's wrong. It's a stain on our country. It's an affront to democracy and decency and the opposite of justice. Tonight we look at how we, everyone, can make a difference. The conversation is inspired by Jocelyn Simonson's new book, Radical Acts of Justice: How Ordinary People Are Dismantling Mass Incarceration. I am entirely thrilled that Professor Simonson is here tonight, along with Professor James Forman Jr., two leading experts on mass incarceration and the road to change. The topic could not be more important or the book more timely. We are so proud to be co-presenting this program with Brooklyn Law School. And thanks to all of you for your partnership throughout and for sponsoring the reception that follows the program. It's been a joy to work with Brooklyn Law School, and I hope it's one of many times that we do these kinds of talks in the future. A special thank you to Dean David Meyer, and I also want to thank N+1 for their partnership. I would be remiss if I did not note that the topic of mass incarceration is deeply important to the Brooklyn Public Library. Our Justice Initiatives team works in this space every day, providing library services within prisons and jails and reentry services for people coming home, one-on-one support, and our Telestory program, which allows people in 10 New York State prisons to connect with their families via free video calls hosted by library branches across the borough. You may have seen some of the Justice Initiatives materials as you came in. They're on a table over there. I would be happy to share more about this work with anyone interested after the program. Before I introduce Professors Simonson and Forman more formally, I want to share that towards the end of the program, you will all have a chance to ask your questions of them. And I want to make sure that you know that Radical Acts of Justice is available at the CBH shop. And following the program, please join us for the reception, explore the book. I know that Jocelyn is happy to sign copies. She'll be at a table. And let's continue the conversation informally with each other. So now it is my great honor to tell you just a little bit more about Professors Simonson and Forman. Jocelyn Simonson is a former public defender and professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. She is the leading national authority on community bail funds. Her work has been cited by the Supreme Court and discussed in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and the Associated Press. She has written for the New York Times, The Nation, N+1, The Washington Post, and others. Radical Acts of Justice is her first book. James Forman Jr. is the J. Skelly Wright Professor of Law at Yale Law School, pipeline program serving first-generation and underrepresented minority students from New Haven who wish to pursue legal careers. He is the faculty director of Yale's Center for Law and Racial Justice and is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Locking Up Our Own. So please help me welcome Jocelyn and James to the stage.
It's a real honor for me to be able to have this conversation with Jocelyn. And before we go any further, the one thing that I want to just kind of acknowledge is that this book is about community, right? It's about people acting collectively. And as authors, we are part of communities as well. So I just want everybody to know that Jocelyn's family is here. Can you, front row here. So please stand up. Yes, good. And a big surprise to me, my mother and stepfather are also here, also in the front row. This book is really so right on time. I'm so happy you have given us this. I feel like, for the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've been going out, giving talks about mass incarceration, about overpunishment, and almost to an event, the first question is some form of, well, what can I do about this? What can we do about this? The we question I like the most. And I, in my talks, devote more and more time to that topic, but no matter how much time I devote to it, the audience wants more. And I've always wanted a book to be able to just hand people and say, oh, well, here's what you should do. Well, Radical Acts of Justice is the book that I've always wanted to be able to hand to audiences, and now I have it to be able to hand to people. And so I will say, not the last bit of editorializing, but one bit of editorializing is do buy this book and do get it signed. You will absolutely not regret it. I thought we would start, if it's okay with you, learning a little bit about what motivations you had to write this book. Like, what was it that caused you to devote the years and years of labor that it takes to produce a book like this?
Great. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, James, for being here with me. Such an honor and a pleasure. So what motivated me to write this book? So I'm a law professor, and I already have the joy of getting to spend a lot of my time thinking and writing about what I want to. And for the last decade or so, I have found that what I want to think and write about is the people who seem to be collectively devoting their energy and love and time to doing things that inspire me, not because they're doing them to be inspirational, but because they're doing them out of necessity, out of community, because they're drawn to do these things. And for a number of years, I was writing about people and groups that I myself was in community with. For example, the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund here in Brooklyn, which then became the Envision Freedom Fund. And I started out by writing law review articles, which I know there are people in this room who have read them, but for those who haven't, can be kind of dense and have a lot of footnotes and aren't necessarily that fun to read, although I sure do love reading them. Or op-eds. And I would write them and then have conversations with the organizers and thinkers who were in them that were incredibly meaningful and fruitful. So I went to a national gathering of the National Bail Fund Network in 2017 or so, and they were reading my law review article, which is great, and they had thoughts on it, and some of them were about things in it that felt right. Some of it were about things that didn't feel right. But some of the comments were, that's a lot of footnotes. And I wonder if there's a way for us to talk about what's happening in a way that's not in a law review article. So some of the motivation comes from conversations with people who either are doing the kinds of things that are in the book or could be, who aren't going to be drawn to more traditional academic writing. So in some ways it was about that. But I also really wanted to tie together some of the thinking that I had been doing about this sort of decade that I was watching happen, starting around 2014, of these kinds of things like bail funds that suddenly seemed to be going from 2 or 3 to hundreds of groups coming together and saying, this seems like what I want to be doing with my energy and time and love or money or whatever part they're able to bring to it. And so to be able to tie these different things together, I write about bail funds, about court watching, about participatory defense, about people's budgets, about these different things that I was seeing because that's where I was located. And to be able to bring them together into sort of one book, one package, so as to try to tell a bigger story, because I have been trying to sort of think about the power of the work, but sometimes putting these smaller groups or smaller acts together under one thing and seeing what they have in common, seeing their power together, can maybe help lift them up in some way.
That's great. Thank you. And I want to talk more about the kind of areas that you choose to focus on. But before we get there, book titles are hard. I think book titles are really hard. And this is a great book title, Radical Acts of Justice. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about where that title comes from for you.
Yeah, sure. So I want to talk about the subtitle too. So it's Radical Acts of Justice.
Yes.
How ordinary people are dismantling mass incarceration. And so Radical Acts of Justice came, it wasn't sort of the initial title of the book. As you know, there's sort of many versions that come through. But in trying to think about what unites the kinds of collective action that I write about, I kept coming back to this scene of criminal courtrooms in which people are physically coming or bringing their resources to help try to shift what's happening. And these places that, and I'm looking because we're in such a beautiful room now, they're not always beautiful rooms like this, but they're big rooms, they're grand rooms, they're rooms that claim to be where justice happens. Often the words justice are in the name of the building or written over the judge's head. They're the place where if someone says, I'm going to go seek justice today, you might, living in New York or America, have a good idea that, maybe they're going to a criminal courthouse. And the acts that I write about in the book are not official acts that come from somebody who we've declared is allowed to decide what justice is or is seeking justice in a traditional way. It's groups that are going into the world to do what they feel needs to happen. They're observing what happens in court so as to report on it to the world. They're helping bail out a stranger out of a larger belief that what's happening there is not justice. They're collectively putting together a video to explain what somebody's life is like to show to a judge. Or they're outside of criminal court and they're trying to think through how can our city or our state or our government be spending its money so as to keep people safe and pursue justice. So they're engaging in these acts and they might not be initially thinking of it that way, but those acts are living out these other ideas of what justice could be. It's not just not that, but because we're collectively sitting here as a community, we're actually starting to treat each other in ways that can start to lead us down a road to seeing that there are others' ideas of justice that could be, or at least we're able to see that the system's claim to be the place for justice can't be right. There are other ones. That's not the only meaning of justice. And so if these acts then become acts of justice, what makes them radical is that they're, from the literal meaning of the word, they're getting to the root of the question of what justice is and what safety is. So trying to take, again, what can seem like a simple act, paying bail for a stranger, and name it as something bigger conceptually was the idea there. The subtitle I can't claim to have come up with myself, How Ordinary People Are Dismantling Mass Incarceration. At first I was actually not a fan of it because of the phrase ordinary people. I had this, especially after spending so much time talking to people who are doing the work in the book, I was like, they're not ordinary, they're extraordinary. What do you mean? But I've actually come around to be a big fan of the word because it might be extraordinary in the sense that the things that come out of it are extraordinary. But the whole point is that these are regular people. They're not people we traditionally think of as experts. Some of them have law degrees, but they're not using the law degree in the way that they're not arguing in front of the Supreme Court. They're doing something kind of ordinary, or they're sitting in court all day long to write down what they're seeing. And so in that kind of everyday sense of ordinariness, with ordinary being like an amazing thing rather than a diss or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that last point. It reminds me of an interview that I read some years ago with a woman from Oakland who was part of the Black Panthers there, and she was saying, like we were not, I know you want to call us extraordinary, she said, but we were ordinary people who did courageous things in this moment.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate that. So you mentioned this before, but I think it's worth sort of going back to this idea of these 4 different kinds of strategies that you weave together in this book. And they're all different examples, right, of what you just said. They're different examples of a kind of radical change that ordinary people acting with courage in this moment can help to bring about. But they have similarities, they have overlaps, but they're also, in the sort of the day-to-day, they're discrete. They're, you choose to do one versus the other for the most part, I think. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what those at a high-ish level, but what those strategies are and what they look like and how they play out.
Sure. Yeah. So there are 4 main strategies or tactics that I write about in the book. And the first 3 are all focused on criminal courts. So they're ways that people are collectively helping, supporting, or collectively learning together in relation to the criminal courthouse. And the first one of those is community bail funds. So I've mentioned those briefly before, but this would be a group that gets together, raises money for, and then bails out strangers again and again and again. Not because they know them, which is kind of the traditional idea of money bail, right? Someone's mom puts up their house or a friend pays bail. So not because they know the person, or at least not because they know them yet, but out of a larger belief that putting somebody in a cage when they're still presumed innocent just because they can't afford the amount of bail that a judge has said is not justice. And not only that, doesn't keep people safe, or they don't feel it keeps people safe. And so a community bail fund, if they do that, and then they do it again, and then they do it again, first of all, some of the money should come back to them when the case is done, and so it can be a revolving fund. But actually, they're making a larger collective and even ideological points through these actions, because bail is set to protect the community, and bail is set to further safety. And so if a group is saying, well, we're not the community, but we're a big part of the community, and we don't feel you're protecting our safety, and you don't represent us, then they're actually engaging in some pretty profound resistance to the system at the same time that they're helping individuals. So that's kind of the basic core of community bail funds, although now that there are hundreds of them, they do all kinds of different forms of organizing. And that's true of so many of these tactics that you can sort of distill them to an essence, but then you have to kind of swirl out because they take on so many different forms, as tactics do sort of in any realm of life. The next one is court watching. And unlike a community bail fund or a bailout, which is helping individuals again and again, a court watching group would be a group that sits or sometimes now listens from home on their computer and observes criminal court. Not because they're going to see like the indictment of a famous person or follow a case that's happening. You can go do that too if you want to, but to go watch a regular criminal courtroom, which is case after case after case after case, not of famous cases, but of cases that are not going to make the news. Maybe they're watching arraignments, maybe they're watching sentencing, maybe they're watching bail hearings, is what a lot of court watching groups do. And they sit there and they watch what's happening, and they affect the people in the courtroom by sitting there, right? So prosecutors and judges and attorneys, court officers are not used to being observed in this way. Criminal courtrooms are often crowded, but they're not often crowded with people wearing matching T-shirts and holding clipboards. Supported by the First Amendment right to actually be there and sitting there. And so immediately they create a different vibe, and they tweet about what they see, they write reports about what they see, and they often do it with a stance of opposition. So here in New York City, Court Watch NYC, which has existed in a few different iterations over the last 8 or 9 years, will wear T-shirts that say Court Watch NYC, yellow T-shirts. prosecutors will get really frustrated that they're there. All courtroom actors don't like it, but prosecutors in particular will bristle from it. And then they will be able to write reports that say, this particular district attorney said that they were not going to be prosecuting turnstile jumps, but we saw turnstile jumps. And the reports, some of them have said things like, not in our name, because the prosecutors claim to be the people of the state of New York. But again, here's a group of actual people who are saying, well, we're part of the people you say you represent, but what you're saying, what you're doing doesn't represent what I think. And so the other thing that court watching groups do, and I found this again and again when I spoke to people doing it, is they do their own reflection. Sometimes it's right after watching, sometimes it's later on at a bar or a restaurant. But it actually involves a lot of educating each other about what they've seen in a way that leads to actually like really profound writing and speaking about what justice is being done, or so-called justice being done in their names. And this is another tactic like bail funds that really took off in the last 8 or 10 years, which is part of the why these tactics in my book, because they're the ones that I was seeing happen in this particular space of criminal court. And then the third one, and none of these tactics are new. I try to note in the book how they've all existed as long as we've had criminal court. But they sort of have this new iteration or way of being. And participatory and collective defense would certainly be an idea and a practice that has long been true, which is people getting together collectively to help people who have criminal cases, often people they don't know. And for a participatory defense hub, this means a group often led by families, never led by lawyers, that meets to talk about ongoing cases, to brainstorm what's happening, to try to understand what's happening, to provide support, often the kind of support that you're not going to find from a lawyer's office, and then to actually work up the case, especially through things like mitigation, like information about somebody that might actually help their case in court. And like with these other two strategies, they do it over time, again and again, and build power, information, and a sense of representation of the community or the people in contrast to the claims of the court. And so those are the three in the criminal court system. I also do talk about other forms of collective defense. For example, abolitionist campaigns for criminalized survivors of violence. So people who are people who survive domestic abuse in different ways and then are criminalized when they act in their own defense. There are some campaigns that I follow in the book that sort of mirror participatory defense in a lot of ways. And then as I was writing the book, around 2020, as we all know, the world shifted in quite a few ways. But one of the ways was that there was a renewed set of uprisings following the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And what I saw was that these organizers who I was in conversation with and writing about these tactics were across the country joining in larger coalitions in a way that they hadn't before to think about their local budgets. Part of it was that the slogan, defund the police, was sort of on people's minds. And I think that was related to what was happening. But there was suddenly more thinking about even just starting with that basic question, how much does our city spend on policing? I think that's a kind of question that in general people were asking. But more and more organizers were starting to get into larger coalitions to really learn about their budgets and reimagine them and write them into what they were calling people's budgets and what they do call people's budgets. And people's budgets can range in breadth, in part because sometimes they're in tiny towns and sometimes they're in big places. But in somewhere like Los Angeles, there were hundreds of thousands of people involved in writing up the first LA People's Budget that reimagined for its city council what its budget could be, and also just reimagined the literal categories. So a public safety budget you might think of, you probably do think of, it probably is here, being about police and jails. That's usually what we mean by our public safety budget. But the LA People's Budget asked people, again, hundreds of thousands of people, what they would want in a public safety budget, and then renamed it reimagined public safety, in which that money was not going to police and jails. They had a corrections budget for that, but it was actually going to things like housing, education, after-school programs, things that people were saying would make them feel safe. And so it wasn't initially part of the plan of the book, but as people were engaging in this larger coalitional work and taking that kind of collective thinking outside of the criminal courthouse to other spaces, it felt fruitful to write about that too.
Well, thank you for that. And this has come up in some of the things you just said when we were talking about some of the strategies, and it really, I think, is a through line in the book. And I wanted to shift and ask a little bit about. So far we've been talking about people, right? And we've been talking about ordinary people. This is also a book about the establishment. And one of the things that comes up again and again in these pages is you have people in positions of power and authority in the system who are taking action that, in your telling, and certainly in the telling of the people you're writing about, is very much against justice. And some of them are people who position themselves, have taken the jobs that they've taken because envisioning themselves as fighting for justice, and not fighting for justice in the way that, like, the prosecutors in Law and Order, right, think that they're fighting for justice. Like, these people have come in some sense out of a resistance movement. So you have Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, and you have this kind of harrowing story of him, sort of throwing a chart back, either actually or rhetorically at actually. I didn't want to say actually and have it not have been in the book, and then like Krasner's people are like, suing me for defamation. You have Alvin Bragg right here in New York who tweets, I'm standing with Tracy McCarter, and then again spends a year and a half in office or some amount of time doing nothing to change that prosecution. And then you have defense attorneys. I mean, we're both former public defenders, and I think, and very much proudly so. I think that that's a big part of our identities to this day. But the defense attorneys don't fare well in this book either, right? So the defense attorneys are resistant to the participatory defense. That family all come together, and they've got their support, and they've got their binder of mitigating evidence, and they show up, and the defense lawyer's like, get out of here, right? Or they tell the family, that's not going to work. Like, you start preparing for how you're going to support your family member in prison, because they're going to prison. Meanwhile, the family's like coming there to make a case that they should not be in prison at all. So what I'm really then struck by as I finish all of this, and I really want to get your take on this, is why is it that so many people who think of themselves as fighting for justice end up in positions of authority where they don't do that?
Yes. I am glad that I get to tell, through telling about the groups doing the work, to see the resistance from people like Larry Krasner, who thinks of himself. First of all, his book is called For the People, that he wrote about himself. So he thinks of himself as representing the people. He has done prosecuting in a different way than Philadelphia has ever seen before. So it's not that he hasn't made change. But Philadelphia Bail Watch spent time, again, sitting there with their clipboards for hours and hours, watching assistant district attorneys, writing down what they were doing, writing down what they were saying. They wrote it up in a report. They brought it to the table. They sat down with the DA. They told him about it. They made requests for changes, and he literally threw the report at them. He was so angry that a group would dare, a group that he thought of as allies, as part of the coalition that got him elected, that a group would dare to spend that much time. What he saw this as minor complaints and missing the big picture. I think. Sorry, he didn't say that. He didn't say anything. He just threw the report and wouldn't talk about it. And there's actually a documentary about Larry Krasner in which it's on PBS, in which you can see they allow people to, record them talking in the diner, and you can see them sitting there making fun of bail funds and making fun of court watchers and really not taking seriously this collective pressure. So part of it is reactions like that. This stop coming at me with this stuff that I think of as little stuff when I'm trying to do big things. Whereas meanwhile, the message actually was, no, this is what you do, right? This is what your district attorneys are doing all day, every day. They're in this arraignment and bail courtroom, and they are asking for bail on the kinds of cases that you said you wouldn't be bringing, let alone not setting bail on. They are not taking the time to explain what they're doing. They are not answering the judge's questions. They are not being responsive. And so you can have grand ideas about changes you want to make, but what are you doing, every hour of every day in this courthouse also has the word justice in its title, I'm pretty sure. In these spaces of justice, when you represent the people, you need to be accountable for this. And I think it can probably be frustrating to be asked to be held accountable for all of that. But if we go back to this question of why can't people make change? I think part of it is the system that you're going into. How do you change what justice is when you're going into a building that's been constructed so that justice is jail? I'm not clear that you can in a big picture way. Although certainly, again, I think things have changed in Philadelphia, right? So it's can you make change? Sure. But can you make this wide-ranging shift in who has the power? Who gets to say what justice is? I'm not sure that you can. And if we're still thinking about prosecutors, I think Alvin Bragg, as you say, is a really glaring example of that in the book. He ran for office tweeting that he #stand with Tracy. Tracy McCarter is a woman, and her case has now been dismissed, but it took a long time, who was prosecuted for murder for, in self-defense, killing her longtime abusive and estranged husband. And Alvin Bragg ran for office saying that he stood with Tracy. And not only that, he further tweeted that we shouldn't be criminalizing survivors. And then he took office and he did not dismiss that case. And he never publicly said why he wasn't, but there was something within that system that was preventing him from doing it, right? I don't think he lied when he said, I #stand with Tracy. That's not my claim about any of these actors. Do people lie ever? Sure. But I think that you're right, that we're thinking about people who actually are trying to make change in some form. But he was not able to do it. And the way this case became dismissed, yes, from his request, but was because of a 3-year-long collective defense campaign from Survived and Punished New York that would not let him be okay with not acting, right? So it was sitting in court in every single court date, filling up that criminal courtroom in Manhattan with red hoodies that said, stand with Tracy, then had a picture of her, and then said, free them all. So connecting her prosecution to the prosecution of all criminalized survivors to the prosecution of everybody. Tweeting about it, having protests about it, and then going to all of Alvin Bragg's appearances that he ever did and asking him about the time he said he stood with Tracy, right? And so they did it again and again and again. And I think he expected that to stop, and it didn't stop. And so eventually the case got dismissed, but after quite a lot of fighting, quite a lot of motions, and some real disdain and vitriol from the judge in the case, Judge Diane Kiesel. We haven't talked about judges, but who also just did not want the public in that courtroom and essentially wrote that out in a 15-page opinion, the way she didn't want it. So for prosecutors, there's something about thinking you're going to have all the power to do what you want, but then being within the system that really has a certain direction of the kinds of action and change you can make. And then for defense attorneys, I think it's probably something similar. Again, I also think of myself as a public defender, yet recognize the public defender who might say, I need to talk to this person alone. Can you all please leave? Or recognize the person who might say, this is not a case in which we're not going to get jail time. I'm sorry. I know this case. I know this judge. I know this criminal courthouse. And I want you all to realize that we're not going to get no jail time here, right? You can just picture the person meaning it. And yet again and again, what happens with participatory defense hubs is that they hear that. And of course, if you hear that from a public defender, especially if they mean it and seem like they have it at heart, you're going to say, okay, and you're going to start preparing yourself. But if you have a collective and you go back to that group and they're like, no, we're not going to accept that. Let's try anyway, because there's a purpose in trying beyond knowing that something's going to happen, right? Because we've recognized our purpose collectively to be doing this work is to be building power and education, and maybe showing James that people are there for him and showing him love, even if it doesn't end in no jail time. And one of the
I didn't
people...
know if I was going to end up as the defendant or the defense attorney in this.
I'll make you the other one in the next anecdote. One of the people I spoke to quite a few times in writing this book is Raj Jayadev, who's out in San Jose, California, and he's the founder of Silicon Valley Debug, and has been a part of sort of practicing this form of participatory defense that a lot of people now emulate. And he's won the MacArthur Genius Award. It's not like I found him from nowhere, but he's been just a generous person I've been in community with for a long time. But he was also really generous with his time during the writing of the book. And so I had quite a few interviews with him. And there was one where he had been doing this work for nearly 20 years at the time of this particular day. And he was a little late to our Zoom, and he came in and he was just like bouncing. And he was like, I have to tell you what just happened. And he said, this is a case. It was someone who was in their hub for a long time. He did a lot of photographing and videoing of things that had happened. He'd been an important part of it, but never had his own case. And then he was arrested and prosecuted, and they were now at a point of trying to deal with the sentencing and figure out the sentencing, but there had been an issue in a sentencing, and they have relationships with public defenders who they trust, and their trusted public defenders said to them, look at this charge, it's going to be jail. And so when you make your video, your collective video, do it. But please, will you make a pitch for a low amount of jail time? Because that's going to be in his interest. And they had a big debate about it because they trust the lawyer. And they decided not to do that. They made a very different video talking about how this trusted artist was needed in the community and was of value to the community. And he was sentenced to no jail time. And Raj came back and he was like, every time I am newly surprised and newly feel the power that somebody tells you this is not possible. It's impossible. And then collectively they go into this space of so-called justice and make the impossible possible. And so each of these systemic actors, I think, is they're trying to do justice in some form, right? They're trying, but whether because they're captured by the system or they're captured by this sense of like, this is how things are, right? This is how the system works, and so let's do our best fight within it. Instead of coming in from a place of saying, we're not part of that system and we are never going to be a part of it. We're just going to come into the courtroom to support people within it, but not to be a part of it. And in fact, Debug was offered money from the county of Santa Clara, to help like actually be there more regularly. And they were like, no, we can't take that money because then we would be a part of the system. Instead of a community group or a group of people that refuses to be a courtroom player in that traditional sense, maybe in part because they see how courtroom players have their imaginations just squashed in terms of, possible ways that the world can be.
See, that last example, too, of not accepting the money, it makes me think of something that is, again, a theme really throughout the book. There's a couple of points where you make it explicit, but then it's also implicit a bunch of times as well, which is this whole question of kind of compromise, and I guess like the cousin of compromise, which would be maybe incrementalism. So we were, for example, I could imagine one of the district attorney explanations, and you kind of hinted at this, is this idea of like, look, you don't understand the big picture. Like, I am making change. I'm doing many of the things you want me to do, but I'm just moving more incrementally than you want me to, right? And so this would be at least one kind of explanation of some of what I think you and I see as intransigence or, just a resistance, right? Could be free framed that way. But then the same thing is true on the side of the activists, right? And you write about this. There are times, it seems, where the people that you write about take a stance against compromise. And there are times where it seems like they take stances in favor of compromise. And I'm just wondering, do you have, picking really any of the, 4 areas, or is there anything that you can say that would cut across that a group of, current activists who are in the room and future activists who are in the room, like how it seems like one of the hardest questions is knowing when is compromise a legitimate small step towards your larger goal, and when is it, co-optation or legitimation or being bought off. Are there any lessons that you can sort of help us with as we try to think about how to land in the right place on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure I have, there's not a rule book for doing it. Although some abolitionist thinkers have tried to write out big, long charts about what kinds of reforms can be reformist or non-reformist kind of thing. But I think what I have seen in talking to organizers, I guess I would say 2 things. One is that I think almost every group recognizes just instinctually, being in their community, that sometimes compromise is going to be good and necessary, and sometimes it cannot be a good thing, right? So I don't think there's any group that's like, we will never compromise. Right. But there is a big hesitation to we can think of compromise in an individual case, but I think really here we're thinking about reform, right? Like a compromise of a policy. It could be a small bail policy from a district attorney. It could be a piece of legislation. It could be an agreement about who can post bail at what window, whatever it might be. But to compromise means looking at more than what the policy states, right? So like more the headline of the policy, and asking as a secondary matter, who is going to have the power and the decisions that get made when we make that compromise, and where is the compromise coming from? So to take one example of something that is a win in a lot of ways in the book, would be that recently, and it actually just went into effect in September, the state of Illinois outlawed money bond. It outlawed money bond. It's incredibly exciting. Would not have happened without the work of the Chicago Community Bond Fund and the coalition that did all the work to support change and incremental reform that led to this statute. The statute itself you could think of as a form of compromise, because there has been already an increase in electronic monitoring and other forms of supervision, arguably an expansion of carceral surveillance in different ways. So we could think of the bill itself as a compromise. But even if we just sort of think, okay, it's outlawing money bond, and that was the goal, it was the goal of the coalition. In order to get there, there's an incredible combination, actually, of refusing to compromise and compromising. So from the beginning, they said we should not have money bond for anybody. And this is an important thing that they never compromised on. They said, we are not going to agree to a new policy that distinguishes between people we're calling violent and people we're calling nonviolent, because we think the injustice we're naming, which is of putting someone in a cage because they're poor when they're presumed innocent, is an injustice for everybody. And we actually they were born from, in 2015, people who were arrested following incidents of police violence and arrested for so-called violent crimes, even if no one was hurt. So they sort of were born from this energy and this sense of there are certain distinctions that we are not going to allow ourselves to be made. And yet there were also in the courthouse in Chicago certain compromises and certain policies that they either, at a table with powerful players or just publicly were supporting changes. For example, a judge having to consider somebody's income before setting bail. That's a compromise, right? It's just a thing that a judge has to consider. And if you don't really want that to be your end goal, and it can feel a little compromisey. But that was one of their strategies. And part of the reasoning behind it was they're going to have to give reasons on the record. And we're going to be court watching, and we're going to be able to see what they're saying. So if we're thinking of this as a larger path of organizing, then maybe there are certain moments that can not just help individuals, like perhaps actually, and it's true, fewer people were incarcerated pre-trial when there was this change in the rule. But if we're looking at our longer vision, it's going to help us actually build power and organize because it's a reason-giving rule rather than something else. So it's just sort of one small set of examples, but it's definitely not a compromise or no. But there are a lot of groups that have particular stances on which they're not willing to budge for bigger reasons.
One thing, you just talked about this group that was founded in 2015 in Chicago, and I think you said that your research began in 2014. Did I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, I started thinking and writing about the stuff in 2012, but these tactics, 2014.
And so that seems really important and interesting as well to kind of dig into a little bit, because given that you've been doing this work from 2012, 2014, and obviously even years before as a public defender, but in terms of studying these groups, at least in 2014, you've seen a lot of ups and downs and kind of ebbs and flows in the kind of national conversation about mass incarceration, right? We both teach at a time when our students come to law school with a knowledge and awareness of the injustices of our criminal system that was just, I was in law school before you. It's almost unimaginable to me when I think back to what, I was in law school at a time when, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, it's only the issue that it had within criminal justice was the death penalty, and only the death penalty, right? There was nothing broader than that, right? And that's just I love the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. It's just an example of where we were as a country in the 1990s in terms of understanding criminal justice as a racial justice issue, right? And now today we're educating a generation of students that Michael B. Jordan's playing Bryan Stevenson, right? They've read The New Jim Crow. They know Ta-Nehisi Coates. They've read Bryan Stevenson. They come to law school, a lot of our students, ready to go. And so that's a change, right? And then we've obviously seen in the politics of, the last 7 or 8 years, we've had moments where it seemed like we were gaining so much ground and ground swells of energy and the largest protest movement in history, all of that. And then we've also seen moments of backlash and regression. And I guess I'm wondering, how do the people that you're writing about experience this moment that we're in now? Like, do they experience it as a moment of retrenchment? Do they experience it as a moment of kind of the country going backwards on kind of promises that it's made and energy that has developed? Or because that's certainly the way that that's like the way that it would, gets talked about, right? In the, the New York Times, kind of at that level. But I'm wondering if that's how it feels on the ground, or if people would talk about and experience this moment that we're in right now today differently than the way I just described.
Right. So if we think of this moment as September and October 2023, it's a useful moment for me because I have been talking about this book with organizers in a lot of the cities that are in the book. And I stopped, the information that made it into the book goes to the end of 2022, right? So it's at least a year later, and I'm having conversations. Like I went down to Knoxville, and I had a conversation with the hub members in Knoxville, Tennessee, who've been doing participatory defense work for 7 or 8 years. And incredible to have those conversations. But also, understandably, what people want to talk about is what's happening right then, not what was happening a year ago when we talked in and went in the book. And there's so having gone to quite a few of these places, Seattle, or I was having a conversation on Friday with people in Austin, Texas, because I'm going there later this week. And there's I'd say that there are a couple of themes. And the first one is that it's not being experienced in those grand terms. It's not being experienced in exactly those terms, but I'd say there's sort of two things. One is that, especially the groups that have been doing these tactics, right? So new tactics are coming up now, right? Abortion funds have always existed, but really are only a year or two in figuring out how, with a lot of money and a lot of need, to do their work. That's not true of these tactics. They've been really we're now at a decade of people understanding and learning from each other, and national networks talking about how to do these work. And as much as the backlash and retrenchment is painful, and it is, and it leads some community bail funds to close, for example, such as here in New York with bail reform swinging back and forth, as much as that's experienced, there's a sense and just a grounded understanding of the organizing and power and energy and knowledge that has been built, and an underlying confidence in organizing and tactics and the potential for change, including in places like Texas and Florida, which we, from where we're sitting, might not be seeing as places of big change. I was on a virtual call, and I'll be in person with the Participatory Hub members in rural Texas, in Houston, and in Austin. And the energy in the good courthouses and the bad courthouses was similarly like, listen to what we're doing, listen to what we're doing, listen to what we're doing. A sense of power and energy and excitement. At the same time, these tactics that I write about, when I was writing the book, I do talk about backlash. For example, there are some states have tried to pass laws outlawing bail funds, like saying only mom can pay bail, basically. That hasn't worked, but they've tried. Many states have pushed back against the work of bail funds. Many prosecutors have pushed back against court watching and tried to create new rules. There are different forms of backlash. But even at the end of 2022, I had not even imagined what we saw this year, which is literally in Atlanta, Georgia, people have been prosecuted for being bail fund activists. So in Georgia, there's a large umbrella of groups that are trying to push back against the building of so-called Cop City, which is a multi-million-dollar police facility that they want to build by raising a forest and building it there. There's a mock city in it, which is why it's called Cop City. And within that movement, there's a bail fund that has long existed, the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, or has pre-existed this movement. And 3 members of it were prosecuted and still have ongoing cases for money laundering. And the money laundering is literally the taking of money from a bank account to pay bail.
Are they being prosecuted in Fulton County? Do you know where they're being prosecuted?
They are. They're being prosecuted in Fulton County, and they're now being prosecuted twice.
So that would be, is that Fonnie Willis is the prosecutor?
So they're now, they're now being prosecuted twice. Sorry. Yes, it is for the individual charges. And now the state attorney general, Cooper, who wants to be governor, has now also brought a larger RICO indictment against activists surrounding Cop City. It's the same courthouse, but a different prosecutor. And I mention this to say it's just we have literally, in an 106-page indictment, the writing out of the criminalization of people collectively taking care of each other and supporting each other in the face of criminalization. So the forms of backlash and retrenchment are growing. And it's scary. And I name Atlanta because it's like actually very scary there right now. There's a lot of people being threatened with years and decades in prison. But when I've been a part of conversations about this, there's also this like, wow, they did that? They must really be afraid of bail funds, right? There's something about the backlash and retrenchment when it's so targeted that can feel energizing. Whereas if you're reading a newspaper, you don't necessarily feel that energy.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we are going to have time for questions from the audience. So be getting your questions ready. My last question is, I said that I thought that this book was so fantastic and so on time because of how many people ask me the question, like, what can I do? What could we do? And so as we sort of close out at least this portion of it, I want to think about the people who are here in the audience and right now I think I want to, if it's okay, you can answer it however you want, but I'm thinking a little bit more right now, not the people that are already doing the work, that are already following one of these 4 strategies or something else similar, but people in the room that have heard enough to say, this sounds pretty important and pretty exciting, and maybe I want to get involved in one of these kinds of projects. So I guess my question to you is, so my statement to them would be go buy this book, and then find somebody else out in the audience who you either know or you don't know, and say, we're going to read this book together and we're going to have a conversation about what we can do in where I live with this book, influenced by this book. But I want to know what you would say to somebody in the audience who's like, wow, okay, 4 strategies. I don't know, like which one is the best of the 4? Like which one, like how do I begin the process of figuring out how to either begin something or join something that already exists? How do I move from this conversation to action?
Well, as your recommendation implies, you can't do it alone. The thesis of my book is not do one of these 4 strategies. It is that when you collectively get together with other people and you do it out of love, anger, right? They're 2 sides of the same caring about each other and caring about what's going on in the world. And you try to help people and you do it collectively and you do it with a sense of greater purpose, then you are going to not just change the individual peoples, but together you'll be changed, and you might even change ideas out there. And of course, that's not going to happen every time you go help somebody. But to the extent there's sort of a what I can do, part of it is looking around where you are and seeing what can be done. And I think a lot of us felt this, especially living in a city during the heart of the pandemic, right? When we were under lockdown, and just like literally people on the floor of your apartment building might need help with groceries. Like there was just people, mutual aid, people taking care of each other. I think because it needed to, started to blossom in kind of organic ways that in some places have kept up and some places haven't. But for some, that's kind of a moment of realizing, oh, there was something really meaningful about that. And it wasn't just bringing someone their groceries. It was bringing someone their groceries in the face of a state that didn't seem to be helping, of a government that didn't seem to be helping people who needed help in that particular moment, or who wasn't doing an adequate job of keeping people healthy and safe in that moment. And so I named that moment just to say that it doesn't have to be one of these four things. But I do think that something like court watching is actually a pretty accessible way for ordinary, non-expert people to learn more about what criminal court is like. So my 1Ls, my first year law students, by Wednesday are going to have gone and observed arraignments in criminal court and write me about them. And they're writing their reflections to me. And this is not organized court watching. This is just individual watching it, right? And so one of the things that we have talked about before, and we will talk about, is that, what does it mean to watch it as a person? And then what could it mean to actually be getting that same education, that same knowledge, and doing it as a community, as little C citizens, as little P the people, whatever it might be. So like, what kinds of collective knowledge can you be doing? It could be a teach-in, right? It could be reading my book, but what kinds of collective work can we do together? And again, I think a lot of this is intuitive. To an organizer, it will almost sound silly, because it's like, of course, that's the point. You do things collectively, and that's how change happens. But if we're not every day doing things collectively in that way, especially in this world, once I've been in these rooms and felt like, once you feel the ideas instead of just reading the ideas, you become transformed by it. So just finding ways to get out into the world. And for people who aren't able to leave their homes, I do think there's virtual forms that can be just as powerful of community and organizing. But I also do think of it as a physical thing of either leaving one's apartment or inviting people in to be in community.